Part 6, The Grand March 1. Not until 1980 were we able to read in the Sunday Times how Stalin's son Yakov died. Captured by the Germans during the Second World War, he was placed in a camp together with a group of British officers. They shared a latrine. Stalin's son habitually left a foul mess. The British officers resented having their latrine smeared with crap, even if it was the crap of the son of the most powerful man in the world. They brought the matter to his attention. He took offense. They brought it to his attention again and again and tried to make him clean the latrine. He raged, argued, and fought. Finally, he demanded a hearing with the camp commander. He wanted the commander to act as arbiter. But the arrogant German refused to talk about crap. Stalin's son could not stand the humiliation, crying out to heaven in the most terrifying of Russian curses. He took a running jump into the electrified barbed wire fence that surrounded the camp. He hit the target. His body, which would never again make a mess of the British latrine, was pinned to the wire. 2. Stalin's son had a hard time of it. All evidence points to the conclusion that his father killed the woman whom he had the boy. Young Stalin was therefore both the son of God, because his father was revered like God, and his cast-off. People feared him twofold. He could injure them by both his wrath — he was, after all, Stalin's son — and his favor. His father might punish his cast-off son's friends in order to punish him. Rejection and privilege, happiness and woe. No one felt more concretely than Yakov how interchangeable opposites are, how short the step from pole of human existence together. Then at the very outset of war he fell prisoner to the Germans, and the other prisoners belonged to an incomprehensible, standoffish nation that had always been intrinsically repulsive to him, accused him of being dirty. Was he, who bore on his shoulders a drama of the highest order as fallen angel and son of God, to undergo judgment not for something sublime in the realm of God and the angels, but for crap? Were the very highest drama and the very lowest so vertiginously close? Vertiginously close? Can proximity cause vertigo? It can. When the North Pole comes so close as to touch the South Pole, the earth disappears and man finds himself in a void that makes his head spin and beckons him to fall. If rejection and privilege are one and the same, if there is no difference between the sublime and the paltry, if the Son of God can undergo judgment for crap, then human existence loses its dimensions and becomes unbearably light. When Stalin's son ran up to the electrified wire and hurled his body at it, the fence was like a pan of scales sticking pitifully up in the air, lifted by the infinite lightness of a world that has lost its dimensions. Stalin's son laid down his life for crap. But a death for crap is not a senseless death. The Germans who sacrificed their lives to expand their country's territory to the east, the Russians who died to extend their country's power to the west, yes, they died for something idiotic, and their deaths have no meaning or general validity. Amid the general idiocy of the war, the death of Stalin's son stands out as the sole metaphysical death. 3. When I was small and would leaf through the Old Testament, retold for children and illustrated in engravings by Gustave Doré, I saw Lord God standing on a cloud. He was an old man with eyes, nose, and a long beard, and I would say to myself that if he had a mouth he could eat, and if he ate he had intestines. But that thought always gave me a fright, because even though I come from a family that was not particularly religious, I felt the idea of a divine intestine to be sacrilegious. Spontaneously, without any theological training, I, as a child, grasped the incompatibility of God and crap, and thus came to question the basic thesis of the Christian anthropology, namely, that man was created in God's image. Either man was created in God's image and God has intestines, or God lacks intestines and man is not like him. The ancient Gnostics felt as I did at the age of 5. And behind all the European faiths, religions, and political, we find the first chapter of Genesis, which tells us that the world was created properly, that human existence is good, and that we are therefore entitled to multiply. Let us call this basic faith a categorical agreement with being. The fact that until recently the word crap appeared in print as S blank 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 has nothing to do with moral considerations. You can't claim that is immoral after all. The objection to crap is a metaphysical one. The daily defecation session is daily proof of the unacceptability of creation. Either crap is acceptable, in which case don't lock yourself in the bathroom, or we are created in an unacceptable manner. It follows then that the aesthetic ideal of the categorical agreement with being is a world in which crap is denied and everyone acts as though it does not exist. This aesthetic ideal is called kitsch. Kitsch is a German word, born in the middle of the sentimental 19th century, and from German it entered all Western languages. Repeated use, however, has obliterated its original metaphysical meaning. Kitsch is the absolute denial of crap. In both the literal and figurative senses of the word, kitsch excludes everything from its purview, which is essentially unacceptable in human existence. 6. Sabina's initial inner revolt against communism was aesthetic rather than ethical in character. What repelled her was not nearly so much as the ugliness of the communist world, ruined castles transformed into cowsheds, as the mask of beauty it tried to wear, in other words, communist kitsch. The model of communist kitsch was the ceremony called May Day. She'd see May Day parades during the time when people were still enthusiastic or still did their best to feign enthusiasm. The women all wore red, white, and blue blouses, and the public looking on from the balconies and windows could make out various five-pointed stars, hearts, and letters when the marchers went into formation. Small brass bands accompanied the individual groups, keeping everyone in step as a group approached the reviewing stand. Even the most blasé faces would beam with dazzling smiles, as if trying to prove they were properly joyful, or to be more precise in proper agreement. Nor were they merely expressing political agreement with communism, no, theirs was an agreement with being as such. The May Day ceremony drew its inspiration from the deep well of the categorical agreement with being. The unwritten, unsung motto of the parade was, "Long live communism, but long live life." The power and cunning of communist politics lay in the fact that it's appropriated this slogan, for it was this idiotic tautology, "Long live life," which attracted people indifferent to the theses of communism to the Communist Parade. 7. 10 years later, which by this time she was living in America, and a friend of some friends, an American senator took Sabina for a drive in his gigantic car, his 4 children bouncing up and down in the back. The senator stopped the car in front of a stadium with an artificial skating rink, and the children jumped out and started running along the large expanse of grass surrounding it. Sitting behind the wheel and gazing dreamily after the 4 little bouncing figures, he said to Sabina, "Just look at them," and describing a circle with his arm, a circle that was meant to take in stadium, grass, and children, he added, "Now that's what I call happiness." Behind his words was more than joy at seeing the children run and grass grow. There was a deep understanding of the plight of a refugee from a communist country, where the senator was convinced no grass grew or children ran. At that moment, an image of the senator standing on a reviewing stand in Prague Square flashed through Sabina's mind. The smile on his face was the smile communist statesmen beamed from the height of their reviewing stand to the identically smiling citizens in the parade below. 8. How did the senator know that the children meant happiness? Could he see it into their souls? What if the moment they were out of sight 3 of them jumped forth and began beating him up? The senator had only one argument in his favor, his feeling. When the heart speaks, the mind finds it indecent to object. In the realm of kitsch, the dictatorship of the heart reigns supreme. The feeling induced by kitsch must be a kind the multitudes can share. Kitsch may not, therefore, depend on an unusual situation. It must derive from the basic images people have engraved in their memories. The ungrateful daughter, the neglected father, the children running on the grass, the motherland betrayed first love. Kitsch causes 2 tears to flow in quick succession. The first tear says, "How nice to see children running on the grass." The second tear says, "How nice to be moved, together with all mankind, by children running on the grass." It is the second tear that makes kitsch kitsch. The brotherhood of man will be possible only in a base of kitsch. Nine. And no one knows this better than politicians. Whenever a camera is in the offing, they immediately run to the nearest child, lift it in the air, kiss it on the cheek. Kitsch is the aesthetic ideal of all politicians and all political parties and movements. Those of us who live in a society where various political tendencies exist side by side and competing influence, cancel, or limit another, can manage more or less to escape the kitsch inquisition. The individual can preserve his individuality. The artist can create unusual works, but whenever a single political movement corners power, we find ourselves in the realm of totalitarian kitsch. When I say totalitarian, what I mean is that everything that infringes on kitsch must be banished for life, every display of individualism, because a deviation from the collective is a spit in the eye of the smiling brotherhood. Every doubt, because anyone who starts doubting details will end by doubting life itself. All irony, because the realm of kitsch is everything must be taken quite seriously, and the mother who abandons her family, or the man who prefers men to women, thereby calling into question the holy decree, "Be fruitful and multiply." In this light, we can regard the gulag as a septic tank used by totalitarian kitsch to dispose of its refuse. 10. The decade immediately following the Second World War was a time of the most horrible Stalinist terror. It was a time when Terezza's father was arrested on some piddling charge, and 10-year-old Terezza was thrown out of her flat. It was also the time when 20-year-old Sabina was studying at the Academy of Fine Arts. There, her professor of Marxism expounded on the following theory of socialist art. If Soviet society had made such progress that the basic conflict was no longer between good and evil, but between good and better, so crap, that is, whatever is essentially unacceptable, could exist only on the other side in America, for instance, and only from there, from the outside, as something alien, a spy, for instance, could it penetrate the world of good and better. And in fact, Soviet films, which flooded the cinemas of all communist countries in that cruelest of times, were saturated with incredible innocence and chastity. The greatest conflict that could occur between two Russians was the lover's misunderstanding. He thought she no longer loved him. She thought he no longer loved her, but in the final scenes they would fall into each other's arms, tears of happiness trickling down their cheeks. The current conventional interpretation of these films is that they showed the communist ideal, whereas communist reality was worse. Sabina always rebelled against that interpretation. Whenever she imagined the world of Soviet kitsch becoming a reality, she felt a shiver down her back. She would unhesitatingly prefer life in a real communist regime, with all its persecution and meat queues. Life in the real communist world was still livable, and the world of the communist ideal made real. In that world of grinning idiots, she would have nothing to say. She would die of horror within a week. The feeling of Soviet kitsch evoked in Sabina strikes me as very much like the horror Teresa experienced in her dream of being marched around a swimming pool and a group of naked women forced to sing cheerful songs with them while the corpses floated just below the surface of the pool. Teresa could not address a single question, a single word. To any of the women, the only response she would have gotten was the next stanza of the current song. She could not even give any of them a secret wink. She could immediately have pointed out to the man standing in the basket above the pool, and he would have shot her dead. Teresa's dream reveals the true function of kitsch. Kitsch is a folding screen set up to curtain off death. 11. In the realm of totalitarian kitsch, all answers are given in advance and preclude any questions. It follows, then, that the true opponent of totalitarian kitsch is the person who asks the questions, a question like a knife that slices through the stage backdrop and gives us a look at what lies behind it. In fact, that was exactly how Sabina had explained the meaning of her paintings to Teresa. On the surface, an intelligible lie, underneath the unintelligible truth showing through. But the people who struggle against what we call totalitarian regimes cannot function with queries and doubts. They too need certainties and simple truths to make the multitudes understand, to provoke collective tears. Sabina had once had an exhibit. It was organized by a political organization in Germany. When she picked up the catalog, the first thing she saw was a picture of herself with a drawing of barbed wire superimposed on it. Inside she found a biography that read like the life of a saint or martyr. She had suffered, struggled against injustice, been forced to abandon her breeding homeland, yet was carrying on in the struggle. Her paintings were a struggle of happiness, was the final sentence. She protested, but they did not understand her. Do you mean that modern art isn't persecuted under communism? My enemy is kitsch, not communism, she replied, infuriated. From that time on, she began to insert mystifications in her biography, and by the time she got to America, she even managed to hide the fact that she was Czech. It was all merely a desperate attempt to escape the kitsch that people wanted to make of her life. 12. She stood in front of her easel with a half-finished canvas on it, the old man in the armchair behind her observing every stroke of her brush. It's time we went home, he said at last with a glance of his watch. She laid down her palette and went into the bathroom to wash. The old man raised himself out of the armchair and reached for his cane, which was leaning against a table. The door of the studio led directly out onto the lawn. It was growing dark. 50 feet away was a white clapboard house. The ground floor windows were lit. Sabina was moved by the two windows shining out into the dying day. All her life she had proclaimed kitsch her enemy, but hadn't she in fact been carrying it with her? Her kitsch was her image of home, all peace, quiet, and harmony, ruled by a loving mother and a wise father. It was an image that took shape within her after the death of her parents. The less her life resembled the sweetest of dreams, the more sensitive she was to its magic, and the more she once shed tears when an ungrateful daughter in a sentimental film embraced the neglected father as the windows of the happy family's house shone out into the dying day. She had met the old man in New York. He was rich and liked paintings. He lived alone with his wife, also aging, in a house in the country. Facing the house, but still on his land, stood an old stable. He had had it remodeled into a studio for Sabina and would have followed the movements of her brush for days on end. Now all three of them were having supper together. The old woman called Sabina my daughter, but all indications would lead one to believe the opposite. Namely, that Sabina was the mother, and that her two children doted on her, worshipped her, would do anything she asked. Had she then herself, on the threshold of old age, found the parents who had been snatched from her as a girl? Had she at last found the children she had never had herself? She was well aware it was an illusion. Her days with the aging couple were merely a brief interval. The old man was seriously ill, and his wife was left on her own. She would go in and live with their son in Canada. Sabina's path of betrayals would then continue elsewhere, and from the depths of her being, a silly mawkish song about two shining windows and a happy family living behind them would occasionally make its way into the unbearable lightness of being. Though touched by the song, Sabina did not take her feelings seriously. She knew only too well that the song was a beautiful lie. As soon as kitsch recognized for the lie it is, it moves into the context of non-kitsch, thus losing its authoritarian power and becoming as touching as any other human weakness, for none among us is superhuman enough to escape kitsch completely. No matter how we scorn it, kitsch is an integral part of the human condition. 13. Kitsch has its source in the categorical agreement with being. But what is the basis of being? God, mankind, struggle, love, man, woman? Since opinions vary, there are various kitsches: Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Communist, Fascist. democratic, feminist, European, American, national, international. Since the days of the French Revolution, one half of Europe is referred to as the left, the other half as the right. Yet, to define one or the other by means of the theoretical principles it professes is all but impossible, and no wonder political movements rest not so much on the rational altitudes as on the fantasies, images, words, archetypes that come together to make up this or that political clique. The fantasy of the Grand March that Franz was so intoxicated by, and his political kitsch joining leftists of all times and tendencies. The Grand March is a splendid march on the road to brotherhood, equality, justice, happiness. It goes on, obstacles notwithstanding, for obstacles there must be if the march is to be the Grand March. The dictatorship of the proletariat or democracy, rejection of the consumer society or demands of increased productivity, the guillotine or the end to the death penalty, it is all beside the point. What makes a leftist is not this or that theory, but his inability to integrate any theory into the kitsch called the Grand March 14. Franz was obviously not a devotee of kitsch. The fantasy of the Grand March played more or less the same role in his life as the mawkish song about the two brightly lit windows in Sabina's. What political party did Franz vote for? I am afraid he did not vote at all. He preferred to spend election day hiking in the mountains, which does not, of course, imply that he was no longer touched by the Grand March, and it was always nice to dream that we are part of a jubilant throng marching through the centuries, and Franz never quite forgot the dream. One day, some friends phoned him from Paris. They were playing a march in Cambodia, and invited him to join them. Cambodia had recently been through American bombardment, a civil war, a paroxysm of carnage by local communists that reduced the small nation by a fifth, and finally occupation by neighboring Vietnam, which by then was a mere vassal of Russia. Cambodia was racked by famine, and people were dying for want of medical care, and the international medical committee had repeatedly requested permission to enter the country, but the Vietnamese had turned them down. The idea was for a group of important Western intellectuals to march into the Cambodian border, and by means of this great spectacle performed before the eyes of the world to force the occupied country to allow the doctors in. The friend who spoke to Franz was one of them who marched with the streets of Paris. At first Franz was thrilled by the invitation, but then his eye fell on the student mistress sitting across the room in the armchair. She was looking up at him, her eyes magnified by the big round lenses in her glasses. Franz had the feeling those eyes were begging him not to go, and so he apologetically declined. No sooner had he hung up than he regretted his decision. Truly he had taken care of his earthly mistress, but then he neglected his unearthly love. Wasn't Cambodia the same as Sabina's country? A country occupied by its neighbor's communist army? A country that had felt the brunt of Russia's fist? All at once Franz felt his half-forgotten friend had contacted him at Sabina's secret bidding. Heavenly bodies know all and see all. If he went on the march, Sabina would gaze down on him enraptured. She would understand that he had remained faithful to her. Would you be terribly upset if I went on the march? He asked the girl with the glasses, who counted every day away from him a loss, yet could not deny him a thing. Several days later, he was in a large jet taking off from Paris, with 20 doctors and about 50 intellectuals, professors, writers, diplomats, singers, actors, and mayors, as well as 400 reporters and photographers.